Okay, so today we're going to be pouring a 24-inch by 24-inch mold. The wood we're working with today is cedar, and it's 8'4", which means it's 2 inches thick. I get my hardwood from a hardwood lumber mill that's about 40 minutes from my house. I purchased my lumber there because it's kiln dried, and they have a wonderful selection of all kinds of wood. All the wood you see behind me is all wood that was purchased there, and so I have a great experience when I go there. Now, every time I go there, one of the things I ask them to do, because some of the pieces I get are larger than my planer will go through, and so I want to make sure at least one side of the board is perfectly flat. So that's called face jointing. Now, what we're looking at here is these two the top parts of these boards are face jointed. If I were to turn it over, I've got a top camera up there we're going to be looking at right now. This is not. It's very uneven on this side, so I would not want to put this side down because I'd have too much seepage of epoxy underneath of it. So if I start with one side face jointed, then I know I've got a perfectly flat board. And that's important because all of this lumber is coming from a mill, as an example. So it's not jointed all the way around and perfectly square. So as long as I get one side face jointed, and then I have them joint one of the edges. I have them run one of the edges through the joiner, so I've got a flat surface there, so that when I put it up against my miter saw to cut it down to get it into the size that I want it to, I've got a 90-degree angle on that, so it goes up tight against my miter saw, as well as when I go to put the board up against the side of the mold, it gets close to the side, and that's always a good thing. Now, this board was approximately around 6 foot, 7 foot or so. So I had them cut the board in half because I'm trying to get as much yield as I can. So out of that one board, I'm going to get 2 molds like this. And so I also have them rip it down the middle for me so that I can ensure that I don't have to put it on my track saw or anything like that when I get home. And they charge a nominal fee to do this for me, and I just find that that's been worth it for me so far. Now, as you can see here, these pieces, like I said before, they're a little bit longer, so I'm going to have to cut these down to get these down to size. Also, since I already have one side face jointed, so I can put the face jointed side down on the table on my planer, run it through, and then get a flat edge on this side, kind of starting to clean that up a little bit. Now, I don't really need to do that, but I've got a reason for it, and I'll tell you that in just a second, because ultimately this is going to have to go through my slab mill when it comes out of here. So really, if you think about it, if you're going to be slab milling and this is your planned top side, well, there's really no need to really go through the process of planing that. There's really no benefit to it because you're going to be slab milling it anyway, which is doing the same effect that the planer is. However, one of the things that I noticed on this particular side, we've got some nice, cool areas where we're going to be able to fill with epoxy. I will need to clean some of that up. Same thing on this side right here, but let's flip these over. On this side right here, it doesn't really matter much, but you got a few more opportunities here. So really, I think on this one, I think probably I'll go with this side up. So if I'm going to go this side up, I need to start with this side being flat because it's going to go down in my mold, and I don't want epoxy to waste epoxy seeping underneath it. Same thing with this one here. You can see I've got all this area here. Again, this needs to be cleaned out, and I will clean that out here in a minute. But this is going to make for some cool things on the top of the board. But let's look at the bottom side of this one. And you can see on the bottom side of this one, there's really nothing great to look at. So of course we want this to be on the bottom of the mold. Now, had I caught that when I did that, I would have had them face joint the opposite side, but I missed that. But the good news is I can run that through my planer and get both of these boards perfectly flat on both sides. As a reminder, you know, a planer does not make a board flat. A planer is a thickness planer. It's only going to make that board thinner. You need a jointer to make a board flat, or you can put it on a slab mill and get it flat that way too. So depending on how you do it, but it's important you start with flat boards whenever you're doing a mold. So from here, I'm going to run these through the planer real quick, and then I'm going to come back, get the measurements for it, get it the way I want, really kind of position it the way I want, and then mark it and cut it on my miter saw, getting it down to the width that I need. So let's head on over to the planer now. All right, so here I'm at my planer. Always want to make sure you're using hearing protection, always. I've got my dust collection coming out the side of it, going over to my dust collection system so that I don't make a mess everywhere. So I'm going to get the planer adjusted, run these boards through. Again, we're going to put the side that's face jointed, meaning the side that's flat, face down on the planer bed so that we can get that top of that perfectly flat as well. Okay, let's do it. Now if you notice, that got stuck in there and I had to push it through. That's because on the top of this there's a lot of wavy, so I'm going to have to play with that a little bit until I can get it going through smoothly. Now another thing you're going to notice is I'm not going to just do one board at a time. I'm going to do both boards as they go through. Why? Because I want them to be the same thickness when I put them in the mold. So if I go down too much down on one and I don't get the other one the same thickness, it's just going to make things a little more complicated when I go to the slab mill. Okay, so now I'm going to go grab a straight edge and we're going to check this for its flatness and just make sure we got it to where we need it to be. If you notice, I kept running them both through like I said before. That way they're both going to be the same thickness because it's a planer. It's a thickness planer. It's not a board straightener. Well, that's about as straight as you're going to get it. Looks good. Now it's going to be time to take it back over to the mold and then we'll put it on the miter saw and get it cut down to fit the mold and then we'll go from there. Okay, so now we've got these through the planer. We've got both sides flat, so we should be good to go there. That way I can use the sides that I want the most. Again, if you're looking at this from the top, obviously this should be the bottom. There's really not as many things that you can do uniquely with that. I can take advantage of a lot of this. And then this part right here, I get this part right here I don't have on the bottom. Of course, I have that all the way through it. And I'll show that to you real quick. It's just got that part. This is on the other side, but that's not really going to add much to it from, from an aesthetic standpoint. Now, so anyway, next I'm going to mark these. So on this side, I'm going to kind of come over here. I don't know if you can see that from above, but I'm just going to mark the interior of that frame. And I'm going to do the same thing here. Now, ultimately, I'm going to cut this first at that mark. But again, remember, this frame kind of comes down at an angle, And so ultimately, I'll end up probably having to cut it again, but I'd rather make 2 cuts on this rather than get it too short. All right, so I'm going to do the same thing on this side. And I've got that mark there, and then I've got this mark here. And just to be safe, I'm going to do the same thing over here. Now, one of the things you notice, I've already positioned this where I want it. This is going to get cut out, so I'm not going to be able to take advantage of this. I could get a little bit here, but that's just, I don't think that's enough. And then I really want some more of this curvature. If I go all the way down like this, I'm just going to end up with that little bit right there. And I'm not so sure that's going to give me a look that I like. So I'd rather have a little bit more on that, once I've got the resin, once it's filled up with the epoxy. So again, we're going to come down here and mark right here on the interior of it on this side. Mark the interior on that side. And of course, I'll put a square across it when I go over the miter saw. Come out here, get it there. Again, I'm going to have to probably cut these twice, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. All right, so I've got those marks. So let's take these over to the miter saw and let's cut these down and let's do our first cut on, okay? Let's go. Okay, so before I get started, because this is thicker wood, I've got this dust collection modification to my Bosch miter saw that I'm going to need to remove because this shroud will get in the way. You can see, I don't know if you can see that or not, but I've already eaten up a little bit. And so it just has to come off. So of course I'm going to get extra sawdust here that I don't want, but that is just the nature of dealing with some of these thick boards. If you happen to have this particular miter saw, this particular dust collection guy that a guy actually printed on a 3D printer, I found him on YouTube, is fantastic. If I can find a link to it, I'll put a link to it down in the description below. All right, so now we've got our board here. I'm going to flip it over and find our marks. Let's see, which side did I make the mark on? Here we go, it's on this side right here. So now we've got that mark right there. And let me get a straight edge real quick and I'll be right back. All right, so here we go. Got a straight edge there. All right, so let's start with this first mark. And let's go right through there with it. Let's see, here we go, all right. All right, so we got that one. Put on our hearing protection. Put my glasses on. Gonna flip this around. Got my straight edge back here. Now, of course, when I do my cut, I'm gonna do my cut on the outside of this line, not on the inside. I come down here and get that lined up. Man, I got a lot of dust. I love my dust collection, and I don't like my dust collection back here. I've got to kind of box that in. It's one of the things I've got to do. I'm probably talking louder than I should be because I got these ear protection things on, and well, you know how that goes. All right, so let's find our marks on here. There we go, right there. And let's turn this around. And maybe I'll get lucky, and maybe just the back edge will be straight enough to be able to get that to line up properly. This time I come this way, so let's kind of check and see. I guess our blade's going to tell us how far off that actually is. And maybe, at least from a miter saw cut, it looks like it's going to be okay. All right, here we go. I find when cutting thick boards, I like to make several passes on it. All right, so from here, I know I want to use this part primarily, so I want all of this to be in it. So whatever I have to take off, I'm going to take off from this side. Like I said before, the interior of the mold is 24 inches. So from here, ultimately, I can just measure out 24 inches. Now, anyway, so let's go ahead and cut this and get it perfectly at 24 inches, and then we'll do the same with the other piece. I will check this piece before I do that, just to make sure that I'm good to go there. And then I was right in my projections. If that's even a way to say that, who knows. All right, let's get down here. Put that back up against there. Yep, still straight line. All right, should be good. Now you can make a legitimate point that, hey, Barry, didn't you say you don't like dust? Didn't you kind of just do twice the amount of dust? Leave me alone. I'm going to go back over and test this real quick. All right, so that fit like a glove, so I guess I've got to change my work habits, okay? Again, I want to take more off this. I want to have more of that curvature down here exposed. So I'm going to measure from this side, and I'm going to come down 24 inches. 4 inches, square and mark that. There we go. Whoops, a little too far. Okay, back over here, line the board up, trace it to make sure I'm good to go. Tap it just a little bit more that way. There we go. Come back and clean you up later, miter saw. All right, so let's head back over to the mold, and always remember, wear your ear protection. Trust me, I know. I have tinnitus in these ears for the rest of my life because I was stupid. Okay, so now I'm going to clean up some of this around through here and then over throughout there to get some of that loose bark out of there, because you don't want any loose bark. You want to try and get as much out of there as you can. So you got something really solid for the resin to affix itself to. So I happen to find these at Harbor Freight, and I'm not usually a huge fan of a lot of things at Harbor Freight, but they've been quite effective. Hopefully you can see this from up top up there. These various pieces that I can use to kind of, get in there and do the stuff we're talking about right now. So I've already got one. Also a big fan of Milwaukee tools, by the way. But I've got one in here right now that's a bigger one. I'm going to start going through this, and we're going to start trying to clean this up. pull my shop back over. Okay. All right, so the good news is that's pretty solid right there. I'll worry about cleaning up that mold here in a second. But that's got all that out of there. There's not really anything loose left in there now. And that's what's super important. Let's check out the other side and see if we've got to do much, if anything, here. Since I've got that thinner one in there, I think that's a good attachment to go into these other areas. So let's try that out. Okay, just got a lot of that out. You probably have some better things to do that with. Sometimes I'm going to go and get a chisel here in a second, and I'm going to kind of dig out some of these other cavities in here too. Well, my son borrowed my chisel set, so all I got is this piece of junk, but hopefully it'll do the work. Get in here a little bit, and I just want to get some of these pieces that are already separating a little bit out and kind of help them along a little bit. Well, I miss having a good set of chisels right now, I have to tell you. I miss it a lot. anybody's a parent out there understands what I mean. See, it's just a matter of time before that cracks off anyway, so I might as well get it over and done with now. You just want to get anything that's naturally going to come off by itself, because really you want that epoxy to get in there. I'm trying to retain this. Can we see that from up at top, this piece right here? I'm trying to retain that gap there, because that'll look cool once epoxy fills this and that. It'll look really cool, because this is going to end up being cut off, so this is going to go to there anyway. Okay. Flip that over and look at the other side. Yeah, we can do some work here too. Now keep in mind too, I like to pay attention to the back as much as I do the front oftentimes, because I want to make the back look almost as good as the top when I do these things. You know, I just take pride in what I do, and I like it to represent the amount of, you know, hard work and effort I put into it. So let me get one of these other tools, and quickly I'm going to kind of deal with that. That's a lot of loose stuff there. Let's get one of these ones with the rounded end down here. Kind of see if we can break some of that loose. Okay, remember, that's not taking off any more that wouldn't have come off on its own over time. Okay, so I'm going to put this in here now, and ultimately once I finish doing this, I'm going to move it over. So you could kind of use really either side of that, although I like this side better just because I've got 2 cracks to fill there. And so I'll be able to pour that mold. So I have another table over there I'm going to be moving these over to when I pour this. And then we'll take over from there. In a minute, we're going to mix the epoxy and figure out what color we're going to do, and then mix that mica powder. And then we're going to pour this and make sure we screw it down to the bottom of the mold with some clamps. You'll see how I do that in a minute. And then we're going to be patient and come back to it and see what kind of character we can give that epoxy. But that's going to be 8 or 9 hours from now, at the very least, probably. All right, and of course it'll set for a total of 3 days for it to cure. All right, so let's move over to the next stage. Okay, so here we are the next day, and now we're ready to mix and pour our deep pour epoxy. I think I'm going to use a liquid pigment today on this, so you'll get a chance to see kind of how that works. But the first thing I've got to do is figure out how much epoxy am I going to need for this. So my wife gave me some notes because she normally does it, so I'm going to read it off my handy dandy notepad I've got here. And that is length times width times height equals cubic inches. You take your cubic inches and you divide that by 1.805, and that'll tell you how many ounces. And then you can go from there. So what we have to do here is we've got to get an average along through here, because you can see from up top I've got this curvature here. It's fairly consistent down through here, but here's where it opens up. So if I'm looking at this as an example, that's about 5 1/4, about 4 3/4, 4 1/4. So I'm going to say roughly about 5 up until right here, and then we open up to be about all the way up to 7 1/2. So to play it safe, because I still have to fill some cracks and stuff over here, I don't want to over mix, but I always keep a spare mold around in case that's already got some wood prep for them smaller. If I need to, I can just go into that if I over mix a little bit. So I think if we do an average here, this is about 1/3 of it. If we do an average of 5 inches, I think we're going to be okay. But then we've also got here and then here. So I'm going to do an average of 6 inches, knowing I'm probably going to have some probably left over. So if that's the case, I have a 6-inch width, right? And then now, as far as my length, I know this is 24 inches. So then I have 24 inches next, right? And then as far as my height is concerned, it looks like I'm looking at right at 2 inches, okay? So let me pull out my handy dandy little calculator here on my phone. And so we'll pull that up, and then we're going to say 6 times 24, times 24 equals times 2 equals, that's 288, and we want to divide that by 1.805. So divide that by 1.805, and that tells us I need basically 160 ounces. So if I take 160 ounces and I divide that by 128, that tells me I need 1.25 gallons, right? So I've got to figure out how I'm going to do that 0.25. So let me do the math for a second in my head, and then I'll come back and tell you what I came up with. Okay, math is not my strong suit. That's why my wife always does this measuring for me. So the calculations I came up to round it up, or just get it as close to possible working with these particular units of measure. And that's why I'm going to do 96 ounces of part A in here, and then I'm going to do 8 ounces of part A in here. So 96 and then 8. So this is ultimately 1.25 gallons, so I can't mix that in this. A bucket that I'm going to be mixing with. Then I'll come back here and I'll put 48 ounces of part B in here and 4 ounces of part B in here. Then pour that into there, or pour them both into the bucket. And then I'll have my 2-to-1 ratio, and that'll get me up to 156 ounces. So I'm gonna be about 4 ounces short. I think I'll make it through. All right, so let's get ready to get that set up and get going on pouring that, all right? All right, so liquid glass, this is the 2 to 4 inch. So it calls for mixing for 6 minutes, so that's what I'm gonna do. One of the things you really wanna look for when you're mixing deep pour is you wanna make sure that there's nothing cloudy, that you're back to a very clear liquid. Now, one of the downsides to mixing in a colored bucket like this, a blue one or red one or any other color that's not clear, is it's hard to tell that, so keep that in mind. Same thing comes for your mica powder or your pigment. It's really hard to tell the color, and I'll show you what I do about that when we actually start putting that in there. So I don't like to mix my color, whether it's a liquid pigment or mica, until I've got it thoroughly mixed. And then I'll add that at that point. That's the only way I found, especially if you're doing mica. How are you going to know if it's not cloudy if you've already put your mica powder in there already, right? Okay, all right. So let's go mixing. I'm going to play a little unique. I'm going to give you some advice how I do it with my phone. You can do it with your phone too, probably. But hey Siri, set a timer for 6 minutes.
6 minutes starting.
You want to make sure you start with a new battery in your drill. I happen to know I've got a new one. See, I'm going around the sides, going all the way around the sides of that bucket. I want to make sure I get everything off the bottom, scraping it across the bottom, because we put that part A in there first and it's much thicker. So I'm going to go around that and make sure I've got that really good. Now, one thing to notice here, I know you're just looking at my knee here, but one thing to notice here, if you're mixing this in one of the other buckets like we first poured into, you've got to be careful hitting the side of that thing with the with this particular mix, with the, I'll call it a whisk. It's not, because you could bust that bucket wide open, and I've been there, done it. That's why I try to mix on top of my molds. Whew, my hand is tired. I mean, doing this on a video is one thing. Normally I set this on the ground, just sit in a chair and do it so much easier. But man, I do a lot of work for you people. Okay, so I'm gonna pull this out here since I got room. I'm gonna just let my whisk go around to shake some of that off of there. And got the bulk of that off. I let it rest over top of my mold, so if any drops go down in there, I don't have to worry about it. So now's the time to add the liquid pigment. I think I'm going to do blue. Now this stuff is super concentrated, but there's a couple things, because we're doing blue, and we're doing blue in a blue barrel, or a blue bucket, it's going to be hard to tell. So what I'm going to do here is grab one of these, I'll dip that down in there, bring it back up, and then I'll be able to see how that's going. Let me get my phone out of the way, and we'll start adding some of the pigment in there and see what is going on. I don't know, it almost looks purple. Okay, now you notice I didn't use very much. That's pretty good. I think I like that. If anything, I may have done a little too much, but I think I'm liking that. I think we're going to be good to go there, and we're going to be ready to pour that in the mold. I happen to have a trash can over here, so what I'm going to do ultimately, let me set that out of the way, is I'm going to take this over, set it on top of my table, and then let this part kind of rest over top of the trash can. All right, so let's move this pigment out of the way. I think this is going to look pretty cool. So we've got some space. I'm just going to leave that sitting right there for now. And I'm going to move this over again, and I'm going to make sure that I've got a few things that have dropped in there. I'm going to make sure that I kind of dust that one more time. I love my Festool stuff. We're going to pour this in here and see how this goes. I think it should look pretty good. And then I'm going to have to fill this area over here. So I probably should move that over there. Actually, I'm going to put this in off to the side temporarily in the trash can. Get that out of the way. And we're going to see if we got the math right on this. If I have too much or too little. The great thing about doing deep pour is if I do too little, hey, it's no big deal. I just mix some more up. So now we've got our surface all clear. Take your time and pour this. Hold on a second. Hold on a second. Let's get you a cool view of this from a different angle too. All right, so now let's pour this. Show you what I do about that in a minute. Okay, let me set this down for a second. A lot of resin manufacturers include these when you buy your resin. And you don't want to have any more on your top than you need, because ultimately it's harder to get off when it comes time to plane it or slab mill it. Set that off to the side for a second. Now I'm going to leave this sitting up here for a second. Now, if you notice here, make sure I've got that fully tightened down here. I use T-track system on my table here, so I don't have to really mess with weights, and this works fantastic for it. You want to make sure your board is weighted down and secured on the bottom, otherwise it'll float. All right, so let's finish pouring here. Get that up to the rim. And notice I'm going along my sides, making sure that fills in, because it's going to get filled in one way or another. So I want to help it along so I can yield my maximal thickness without having to pour any additional resin or mix any additional resin at the end of the day, I guess. Set that down again. This is a lot of fun. Okay. These cracks are going to look cool at the end. Very cool, actually. And ultimately, if I don't get enough, and I don't want to have to really redo the whole thing, I can just fill any open valleys with tabletop. Just do a clear tabletop. You'll never notice the difference. Really want to make sure you've got one of these. See all those bubbles there? A lot of people freak out and spend way too much time worrying about bubbles, in my opinion, on deep pours. And I don't really care about them that much. I'll spend a little bit of time working with it, but not very much. And the reason for that is this is going to go on my slab mill when this comes out of here. You know, this boards like this can typically go one of two ways. I'll either keep it at 24 by 24, or I'll end up, I won't do it with this one, but sometimes if I get it just right and I've got equal boards on both sides, I can just cut it right down the middle and have two 12 by 24 boards. That makes sense. Got a little spillage from the bucket there on my work table. One thing you do have to be careful with when you're doing a T-track system is you do not, I repeat, do not want to get resin in your tracks, because you're going to be replacing that track. Okay. On the sides there, this is looking really good, I think. It's going to look cool. Very cool, I think. So on the side, make sure we've got something on all of that. Get that over into there. And I'm right up towards the edge of that. Now, what you don't want to do is overpour and have it come over on your board. You want to avoid that. Even if you end up with it maybe over on one side but not quite on the other, that probably means one of two things. Either your board was not perfectly flat when you put it in there, or ultimately the boards were not the same thickness. That's why I ran these boards through the planer at the same time, making sure that they were the same thickness. But either way, when you go to either run it through a planer or you go to run it through your slab mill, wood is much easier to take off than epoxy. Epoxy's hard, rock hard, solid. And so, you know, your planer struggles with it, your slab mill struggles with it. And so you want to really only have to take off as much as possible. Now, again, I talked about bubbles. Yes, I'm going to hit these bubbles here. Well, I'm not going to hit them. I'm going to heat them and make them go away. And I might do that for like 10 or 15 minutes. But after that, I don't worry about it. I don't worry about it because I'm just going to end up just taking all that off anyway. All right, so all we got to do is just let this bad boy cure. It's going to set for about 3 days. Should be great. You know, I'll check back on it again in about 20 minutes and then maybe once an hour for a while, because what I'm expecting to have happen is for some of that epoxy is going to keep finding some voids, either a little bit underneath or around the sides and edges, and I may lose a little bit. But that's one of the reasons I start with a much thicker board than my desired end result. Because ultimately, you know, I know I'm going to take that down because I'm going to have to slab mill the top, then flip it over and do the back to make sure I'm back all the way down to the natural wood. Any resin that may have seeped underneath of it, I want to be able to take that off. So that means you're going to lose some thickness in that process. And then I have the option to take it down as thin as I want for my ultimate, ultimate thickness. But that's why I start with at least 2 inches. Okay, there you go. So the next step, obviously, is this bad boy is going to cure like we talked about. After 3 days, I'll take it out and demold it. I try to do my slab mill where I let things, where I've got a bunch of them. You can see right back there, that's a 5 foot by 30 inch table. I've got another one over there. That's zebra wood. Over there, I've got one I'm looking across the shop that is black walnut. I have probably 6 other 24 by 24 pieces of different species of wood. Here beside me, I've got one that I just poured. That's another video that I did that I'm in the process of doing. That should be pretty cool. You should check that video out when it comes out. But that's a 32 by 18 and a half. Or I'm sorry, 36 by 18 and a half. And then right over there, I have another 5 foot by 30 that I'm going to be making a video on here in a second, pouring the resin into that one. So lots of things going on, but I like to get a bunch of them all together and just do them all in one day. I typically go outside. I've got a table I pull out of a shed out back, and I put it in front of the house in the driveway, and I put a canopy over top of me, and then I get the slab milling away. All right, I know we're not in a wood shop right now. This is actually inside my home, and this is where I film another YouTube channel that I have called Studio Talk with Barry Johns. If you happen to be a musician, enjoy home recording, go check that out. I think I can help you along the way there, like I hope to be able to help you in the woodworking side of things. So I realized I didn't film an ending to the video, so ultimately what you're going to see next is, well, first of all, let me say this. This video, as well as one previously, ended up being quite long. Now, you do get a chance to see every step of the way, which I thought would be beneficial. And in my opinion, it would have been worth my time to invest that time when I was learning how to do all of this. But obviously, I'm not going to take it to the stage in one video where I actually end up with a finished product. So know that I will be making a second follow-up video to this one that will include me taking the project out of the mold, demolding it, ultimately putting it on my slab mill and talking about that, which is basically a router sled because it's too big to go through my planer. And so getting all that down to where it's super flat, flipping it over, getting any existing resin off the bottom of it, then bringing it back inside and sanding it for a very long time and getting it to the point that it's ready for finishing. Ultimately take my my router to it and do whatever edge I decide to put around the perimeter of the top of it. And then get that all set and ready for finishing. And then I'll decide where I want to go with finishing. And we'll talk about the options that I particularly like, whether that's between doing a typical tabletop example, an epoxy tabletop, or whether we're going down the route of doing polyurethane or monorubio coat, Odie's oil, whatever it may be. There's lots of options out there. And I can talk about my feelings on all of those. And I've had great successes with all of them, depending on the application. So anyway, leave some comments down below. Tell me what you think about this. Again, hey, come check me out on this channel too if you have any interest in that. Otherwise, just stick with the woodworking channel, all right? But until next time, I hope all of you have a great day. Bye-bye.